Real nightmares.
The apartment had been too good of a deal to pass up. Small but affordable, nestled in a quiet part of the city, it seemed perfect for a fresh start. After months of saving and searching, Natalie finally had a place of her own, far from the chaos of her old life. She pulled her suitcase into the hallway, glancing at the peeling wallpaper and scuffed wooden floors. The place had character, she told herself, though the dim lighting made the space feel smaller than it was. The silence settled around her, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the floorboards under her feet. Her new roommate, Ian, had introduced himself briefly when she first arrived. He had been polite but distant, his gaze flickering away from hers, as though he was distracted by something unseen. "I work odd hours," he explained vaguely, disappearing into his room before she could ask more. That first night, Natalie unpacked in silence, grateful for the solitude. Still, something about the apartment felt off. She shook off the feeling as nerves. It was just a new environment, a place she would soon call home. At least, that's what she hoped. The first few days passed uneventfully. Ian kept to himself, and Natalie barely saw him aside from the occasional rushed goodbye as he slipped out the door at odd hours. She chalked it up to him being a night owl, maybe even working a night shift. The silence was comforting at first. No awkward small talk, no forced socializing. But then, the absences became more frequent. Ian was gone for days at a time without explanation. His room would be eerily quiet. Yet Natalie sometimes heard faint, inexplicable sounds coming from the hallway. Footsteps that stopped just outside her door, the soft click of a door closing. But when she checked, the apartment was always empty. It wasn't just the noises. Little things started to bother her. One night, the front door was slightly ajar when she came home, though she was sure she had locked it that morning. Another time, Ian's keys were left in the bowl by the door, yet he hadn't been back in days. She found herself growing uneasy, her imagination crafting scenarios she didn't want to believe. Still, she brushed off the creeping discomfort. People had their quirks. She would ask him about it when he came back. If he came back, 3 days passed, and Ian still hadn't returned. Natalie found herself becoming more anxious with each hour. His room remained closed, the silence in the apartment thick and suffocating. The sense of unease that had crept in slowly was now undeniable. Curiosity gnawed at her, and despite feeling like an invasion of privacy, she decided to check Ian's room. Maybe there was a clue about where he'd gone. She hesitated briefly before opening his door. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tightly. It smelled faintly of damp wood and something else she couldn't quite place. At first glance, it seemed normal. Just an unmade bed, scattered clothes, and a few personal items. But on the corner of the desk, tucked under some papers, something caught her eye. A photograph. It was old, yellowed at the edges. A woman stood in the foreground, smiling, with the apartment behind her. But it wasn't Ian with her. It was someone else, a man she didn't recognize. Flipping it over, she found a date scrawled on the back. 1998. That couldn't be right. The room felt colder suddenly, as if a draft had swept through the walls. She quickly returned the photo, her heart pounding. The sense of wrongness thickened. Why would Ian have an old photograph of someone else? Someone who had clearly lived here long before either of them. Natalie left the room hurriedly, her skin crawling. Something wasn't right, and she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. The photograph haunted her thoughts. Who were the people in it, and why was it hidden in Ian's room? Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something critical. The growing sense of unease made it impossible to focus on anything else, so she decided to dig deeper. There had to be a logical explanation. She started with the building manager, an older man named Mr. Fletcher who was rarely seen and even more rarely involved. When she asked about previous tenants, he gave her a tired, dismissive look. "People come and go," he said, waving a hand as if shooing away her concerns. "Young folks move in, find better places, leave. Nothing strange about it." "But what about the man who lived with Ian before me?" she pressed, her voice lowering instinctively, as if the walls themselves were listening. Mr. Fletcher paused, his face tightening. "There've been a few. Last one, though, disappeared, didn't say goodbye or nothing." Just vanished. Place sat empty for a while. People leave for all sorts of reasons, I suppose. The weight of his words sank into her chest. Vanished. Just like Ian was doing now. Back at the apartment, Natalie dug through old property records online, reading late into the night. The deeper she went, the more the pattern emerged. Roommates who came, stayed for a short time, then left under strange circumstances. Some had disappeared entirely, leaving no trace behind. And now Ian was following the same path. Ian returned the next night, long after midnight. Natalie heard the door creak open and the faint sound of his footsteps as he shuffled down the hallway. Her heart raced. She had been lying awake, her mind spiraling with questions and the heavy weight of the secrets she had uncovered. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed answers. She got out of bed and approached his room, her hand trembling as she knocked on the door. There was a moment of silence before it opened slightly. Ian stood there, his face partially obscured by shadows, but something about him seemed off. His skin looked paler, his eyes sunken and lifeless. "Ian, where have you been?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He blinked slowly, his gaze distant. "I had things to take care of." "That's not an answer," Natalie said, her frustration bubbling up. "I found a photo in your room, Ian, and I talked to the building manager. People who live here, they vanish. Where have you been? What's going on?" Ian's expression didn't change, but his voice lowered, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have done that, Natalie. There are things you don't understand, things you're better off not knowing." She stepped back, a chill crawling up her spine. His voice, his posture. It wasn't just eerie, it was wrong, as if the person standing in front of her wasn't Ian anymore. "What do you mean?" she demanded, fear creeping into her voice. He sighed heavily, his eyes locking onto hers. "This place, it takes people, Natalie. It won't let them leave." "Not really." Natalie's pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? Are you saying the apartment is?" But before she could finish, Ian took a step toward her, his presence suffocating. "You should have left when you had the chance." Natalie's breath hitched as Ian stepped closer, his eyes no longer the one she recognized. He was different, hollow, like something had taken over him. The walls seemed to close in around her, the apartment itself pulsating with a dark, oppressive energy. She needed to get out. Without another word, she turned and bolted down the hallway. The air felt thick, making it harder to move, like running through water. Behind her, she could hear Ian's slow, deliberate footsteps echoing unnaturally through the apartment. She reached the front door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside. Panic surged through her. She pulled harder, her hands trembling. The lights flickered above her, casting long, warped shadows across the room. "Come on," she whispered frantically, forcing herself to stay calm. Suddenly, Ian was there, standing just feet behind her, his presence like a shadow creeping into her thoughts. "You can't leave, Natalie. The apartment, it won't let you." She turned to face him, her mind racing. "I don't belong here," she said, backing up against the door. "I'm not going to disappear like the others." Ian's face twisted into a grim smile. "You already do. It's just a matter of time." In a final surge of desperation, Natalie grabbed a nearby lamp and swung it at him. Ian staggered back, giving her just enough time to throw herself against the door one last time. This time, it gave way. She stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, and ran without looking back. Outside, the cool night air hit her face, but the chill from inside the apartment lingered. Even as she made it down the street, she couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment, its darkness, had followed her, and she feared it always would. Sarah stared at the peeling wallpaper of the narrow hallway as she dragged her suitcase into the small apartment. It wasn't much, but after months of searching for an affordable place in the city, this old building had been the only real option. The rent was low, the neighborhood was safe enough, and most importantly, the roommate, Emily, seemed polite and easygoing. Emily, who had greeted her with a soft smile earlier, now hovered in the kitchen, unpacking groceries. She was about Sarah's age, with short dark hair and a calm demeanor. They'd exchanged pleasantries over the phone and during a brief tour of the apartment a week ago, but they hadn't spoken much beyond that. "It's not much," Emily said, glancing around the apartment, "but it's home." Sarah nodded, appreciating the understatement. The apartment had a lived-in quality, slightly damp with the lingering smell of dust and something else she couldn't quite place. The hallway was long, leading to 3 rooms: her own bedroom, the bathroom, and a third door at the end, which Emily had said was used for storage. "You won't need to worry about that one," Emily had remarked casually, motioning toward the door. "It just stays locked. I have a lot of old stuff in there." Sarah had shrugged it off. Everyone had their quirks, and the apartment seemed fine otherwise. Still, there was something about that locked door that made her uneasy, though she couldn't put her finger on why. "Thanks again for letting me move in," Sarah said, forcing a smile as she unpacked her things. "I'm really looking forward to starting fresh here." Emily smiled back, her eyes unreadable. "Of course. I think you'll fit right in." A week had passed since Sarah moved in, and life in the apartment settled into a comfortable routine. She spent most of her days at her new job and her evenings quietly reading or cooking simple meals. Emily kept to herself, often disappearing into her room early in the evening, leaving Sarah to enjoy the apartment in peace. It felt like a perfect arrangement until the noises started. It was subtle at first, just a faint scratching sound that Sarah assumed was coming from the old pipes in the walls. The building was ancient, after all, but one night, as she lay in bed, the noise became more distinct, coming from the end of the hallway. It sounded like whispers. Sarah sat up, her ears straining to hear. The sound was muffled, barely audible, but unmistakably there. Whispers, followed by soft sobbing. Sarah pulled her blanket tighter around herself, trying to convince herself it was just the wind or the creaking of the old building. Still, the locked door at the end of the hallway lingered in her mind. The next morning, Sarah mentioned the noises to Emily over breakfast. "I heard something strange last night, kind of like whispering, maybe the pipes or something." Emily looked up from her coffee, her face neutral. "It's probably just the building settling. You get used to it after a while." Sarah nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that Emily's response had been too dismissive, too quick. Later that night, the sounds came again, louder this time. Scratching, whispering, and the unmistakable sound of someone softly crying. Lying in bed, Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, hoping sleep would take her. But the feeling of unease had burrowed into her chest, and she knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. The noises didn't stop. Every night, the same strange whispers and faint sobbing echoed down the hallway, coming from behind the locked door. Sarah found herself becoming increasingly fixated on it. During the day, she'd brush off the unease, telling herself it was just an old building making typical sounds. But when the apartment grew quiet at night, the tension returned, prickling at the back of her neck. She began paying closer attention to Emily, too. The easygoing demeanor from the first week was fading. Emily seemed distracted, distant, and more secretive than before. She would retreat to her room early, emerging only late at night to leave the apartment for hours at a time, always looking disheveled upon her return. Sarah couldn't help but feel that something about her roommate was off. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen, Sarah worked up the nerve to ask, "You haven't heard those noises at night? From the storage room?" Emily paused mid-bite, then slowly set her fork down. Her eyes darkened, and for the first time, Sarah sensed a wall go up between them. "I told you before, it's just the building. Don't worry about it." Sarah nodded, but the atmosphere had changed. The kitchen felt colder, heavier. There was a finality to Emily's tone, like the conversation was not to be had again. Sarah's chest tightened with a creeping sense of dread. Later that night, as Sarah stood in the hallway staring at the locked door, she felt compelled to do something. She leaned in close, pressing her ear to the door. The whispering was louder now, clearer, but just as she strained to understand the words, the door handle moved. Her heart raced. She jumped back, but the door remained locked, silent. The next morning, Emily's behavior took an even stranger turn. Over breakfast, Emily barely acknowledged her, her eyes occasionally flicking up as if measuring Sarah, as though something had shifted between them. The way Emily glanced at her was unsettling, almost predatory. The air in the apartment grew suffocating with tension. Sarah knew she couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. The locked door felt like a weight in her mind, pressing her to discover what lay behind it. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. Emily had left the apartment once again, slipping out after midnight without a word. The air felt thick with something dark, and the whispers from the locked room seemed louder than ever. Unable to bear it any longer, Sarah knew she had to investigate. Her curiosity and fear had reached its breaking point. She remembered the drawer in the kitchen where Emily had stashed a set of keys. Her hands trembled as she rifled through it, fingers brushing against cold metal. Key in hand, Sarah approached the locked door, her heart pounding against her ribs. The whispering seemed to grow quieter as she neared, as if whatever was inside knew she was coming. She hesitated, then slid the key into the lock, turning it with a slow, deliberate motion. The door creaked open, revealing the room beyond. The smell hit her first, a rancid mix of dampness and decay. She gagged, covering her nose as she stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by the flicker of candles placed around what looked like an altar. Symbols she didn't recognize were scrawled across the walls in dark, dried stains. But it was the figure in the corner that sent a chill crawling down her spine. Chained to the wall was a person, gaunt and pale, their wrists raw from struggling against the heavy shackles. Their eyes, hollow and sunken, met Sarah's with a desperate plea. "Help me!" The voice was barely a whisper, their breath shallow. Sarah's mind raced as she staggered back in shock. What is this?" she gasped, glancing frantically between the altar and the prisoner. The person winced, struggling to speak. "Emily, she's not human. She's been doing this for years. Please, don't let her take you too." Sarah felt the room spin. This wasn't just some strange hobby or old storage space. This was something far worse. The missing persons reports she'd seen on the news over the last few months flashed through her mind. The pale figure looked disturbingly similar to one of the missing faces. Just as Sarah turned to leave, she heard the apartment door creak open. Emily was back. Panic surged through Sarah's body. She hurriedly closed the door to the locked room, her mind racing. She had to get out. She had to escape this nightmare. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears as she backed away from the door, trying to keep her movements silent. She heard Emily's footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, almost as if Emily knew what she had done. There was no time to waste. Sarah bolted toward the front door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck, no locked. She twisted the handle frantically, but it refused to turn. Her heart sank. How could it be locked from the outside? Panic flooded her veins, and she turned just as Emily appeared at the end of the hallway, her face shrouded in shadow, eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You shouldn't have gone in there, Sarah," Emily said softly, her voice eerily calm, as though nothing unusual had happened. Sarah backed up against the door, fear clawing at her throat. What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What's going on in this apartment? Who was that in the room?" Emily stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "I tried to protect you from this," she said, tilting her head slightly. "I like you, Sarah. You seemed different. But you just had to know, didn't you?" Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps. You're keeping people in there, Emily. Why? What are you?" Emily's lips curled into a cold smile, her gaze darkening. "This place, it demands sacrifices, and I've been giving it what it needs. For years." The word struck Sarah like a blow. "Sacrifices," she whispered, horrified. "You're killing people?" "I'm not killing them," Emily corrected, her tone chilling. "The apartment is. I simply offer it what it needs, someone to keep the hunger at bay. The ones before you, they didn't last long. But you, Sarah, I had hope for you." Sarah's stomach churned. "You're insane," she spat, edging toward the hallway. "I'm leaving." But as she tried to move past Emily, a cold gust of wind surged through the apartment, rattling the windows and sending a wave of oppressive energy down the hallway. Sarah froze, the darkness around her seeming to deepen. It was as if the very air in the apartment had come alive, thickening with a malevolent force. "You're not leaving," Emily said softly, her voice like a razor's edge. "You're already part of this place now. You belong to it." Desperate, Sarah grabbed a heavy lamp from a nearby table and swung it toward Emily. The lamp connected with a dull thud, sending Emily stumbling back. Without wasting another second, Sarah dashed toward the back window. She could hear Emily groaning behind her, but there wasn't time to check if she'd get back up. The window was her only hope. Sarah yanked it open, the cold night air hitting her face like a slap. But just as she tried to hoist herself through, a forceful grip seized her ankle. Sarah screamed as she was pulled back into the apartment, the window slamming shut on its own. Emily stood over her, blood trickling from her temple where the lamp had hit, her expression a mix of fury and satisfaction. "You can't escape," Emily whispered, her grip tightening. "You're mine now." The apartment seemed to hum with life around them, the walls closing in, the dark presence growing stronger. Sarah's mind raced. She had to find another way out, but it felt like the apartment itself was trapping her. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled against Emily's grip, but the more she fought, the tighter it became. The apartment seemed to pulse around her, a living, breathing entity that fed off her panic. The walls felt like they were closing in, and every shadow seemed to stretch and twist with malevolent intent. "You're not getting out," Emily hissed, her voice devoid of warmth. "No one ever does." Desperation clawed at Sarah. She had to do something, anything, to break free. With all the strength she could muster, she kicked hard at Emily's leg, loosening her grip just long enough for Sarah to scramble to her feet. She raced toward the front door again, yanking at the handle, but the same unnatural force kept it sealed tight. There was no way out. Behind her, Emily rose slowly, her face a cold mask. "There's no point, Sarah. The apartment, it chooses who stays. And it's chosen you." As the words sank in, Sarah realized with mounting horror that Emily wasn't lying. This wasn't just about Emily being some kind of deranged captor. Something far darker, far more powerful, was at play. The apartment itself had taken hold of her, pulling her into its cursed cycle. In the midst of her terror, Sarah's gaze fell on the locked room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar now, as if beckoning her inside. From within, the whispers had returned, louder this time, mocking, taunting, drawing her in. Emily smiled darkly. "It's calling you," she said. "You can feel it, can't you? It's too late now." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. The whispers swirled around her, a chorus of voices that tugged at her mind, weakening her resolve. Her legs felt heavy, her body sluggish, as though she were being pulled toward the room against her will. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. I won't let it take me." But the apartment had other plans. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, warping and bending like it was alive. The walls groaned, and the air grew thick and suffocating. The room at the end of the hallway was drawing closer, as though the space itself was reshaping to bring her to it. Emily watched, her face devoid of emotion. "You don't have a choice, Sarah. You never did." The realization hit Sarah with brutal clarity. She was trapped, not just by Emily, but by the apartment itself. It was a predator, and she was its prey. There was no escape. As her body neared the open door of the locked room, Sarah felt a cold hand brush against her mind, whispering promises of release, of rest. All she had to do was let go. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, the door swinging open to engulf her in darkness. Days passed, and the apartment was quiet again. The locked room at the end of the hallway was once more sealed shut, its dark secret hidden behind the heavy wooden door. In the living room, Emily sat calmly at the small dining table, sipping her coffee as the faint light of the morning sun filtered through the dusty windows. The air felt different now, still, heavy, as though the apartment itself was content. Its hunger had been satisfied, for the time being. Emily stood, moving with a slow, deliberate grace as she walked toward the hallway. She paused outside the locked door, her hand resting gently on the frame. From behind the door, a faint sound could be heard, soft sobbing, muffled whispers. A small smile touched her lips. The apartment had claimed another soul. Sarah was gone, though traces of her remained. The apartment had absorbed her into its cursed cycle, just as it had with so many others before her. The whispers of her voice joined the chorus behind the locked door, forever trapped in the darkness. Emily returned to the living room and sat at her laptop, scrolling through a list of new apartment listings. She posted another ad for a roommate, the same ad she had posted dozens of times before. A few hours later, the doorbell rang. Emily rose, smoothing her hair as she walked to the front door. When she opened it, a young man stood on the threshold, holding a small suitcase and smiling nervously. He looked around the apartment with curiosity and a hint of apprehension. "Hi, I'm here about the room for rent," he said, his voice hopeful. Emily smiled warmly, stepping aside to let him in. "Of course, come in. You'll love it here." As she closed the door behind him, the apartment seemed to hum softly, almost in anticipation. Another victim had arrived, and the cycle would begin again. Alex stepped into the apartment, dragging a suitcase that seemed heavier with every passing step. The place wasn't much, just an old two-bedroom unit on the edge of town. But it was affordable, and more importantly, it was an escape. After a grueling semester at college, the isolation offered by this new apartment felt like a welcome reprieve. The building itself was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as if the other tenants were ghosts moving silently through the halls. The living room was dimly lit, with second-hand furniture arranged haphazardly. Across the room stood Sam, the new roommate. Sam was already there when Alex had arrived, sitting perfectly still on the worn-out couch, reading a book. At first glance, nothing seemed off, until Alex realized Sam was wearing a mask. The mask wasn't ornate or colorful, just a plain, expressionless face. It was unsettling, but Alex didn't want to make things awkward on the first day. "Hey, I'm Alex," they said, trying to break the silence. Sam looked up, the mask tilting slightly. "Sam," was the only response, muffled through the thin material. They shook hands. Sam's grip was firm but cold. Alex couldn't help but glance again at the mask, wondering why someone would wear such a thing indoors. Sam offered no explanation, and Alex didn't ask. Some people had their quirks, after all. Yet, as Alex unpacked in their room, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first night in the new apartment should have been restful, but Alex's sleep was anything but peaceful. They woke in the early hours of the morning, drenched in sweat, the remnants of a disturbing dream clinging to their mind. In the dream, Sam had stood at the foot of the bed, still as a statue, the expressionless mask facing Alex. No words were spoken, but the weight of Sam's presence had been suffocating. Shaking off the unsettling dream, Alex sat up, trying to catch their breath. The apartment was silent, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. But as they lay back down, hoping to drift off again, a faint noise caught their attention, a soft, muffled whisper coming from Sam's room. Alex froze, straining to listen. It wasn't words, exactly, but a low, rhythmic murmur, like someone talking in their sleep, or worse, chanting. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Sam had a habit of talking in their sleep, or maybe Alex's tired mind was playing tricks. Still, the sound crawled under Alex's skin. After a few tense minutes, the whispering stopped, and the apartment returned to its oppressive silence. Telling themselves it was just nerves, Alex rolled over and tried to fall asleep. The nightmares didn't stop. Every night, Sam appeared in Alex's dreams, standing at the edge of the bed, always silent, the blank mask an oppressive presence that seemed to draw closer with each passing dream. During the day, Sam's behavior only deepened Alex's unease. Sam rarely spoke, and when they did, it was in short, emotionless sentences. Worse, Sam never seemed to sleep. No matter how late Alex stayed up, Sam was always awake, sitting in the living room with the mask on, staring at nothing. Days blurred into nights, and Alex found it harder to concentrate at work or in class. The weight of the apartment's eerie atmosphere seemed to cling to them, even when they were outside. When they finally confided in a few friends, their concerns were waved off. "You're just tired," they said. "Your new roommate is just a little odd. Nothing to worry about." but it felt like something more. The whispering continued at night, soft murmurs slipping through the thin walls, always just quiet enough to remain unintelligible. Alex became obsessed with understanding Sam's strange behavior, the constant wearing of the mask. Then, one day, Alex stumbled upon a clue. While searching for something in the hallway closet, their hand brushed against the edge of a worn-out box. Inside was a photo, old and faded. In the picture, Sam stood without the mask, but the face underneath was twisted, grotesque. The skin was misshapen, as though melted, with dark hollows where eyes should be. Alex dropped the photo, heart pounding. The photo haunted Alex for days. Every time they looked at Sam, sitting on the couch or quietly moving through the apartment, the image of that disfigured face flashed in their mind. The mask was no longer just a strange quirk. It was hiding something. Something awful. Finally, Alex couldn't take it anymore. One evening, as they sat across from Sam in the dim living room, Alex decided to confront them. "Sam, why do you wear the mask all the time?" Alex asked, trying to keep their voice steady. Sam didn't respond immediately. Instead, they turned their heads slightly, as though considering whether to answer at all. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. "You don't want to know," Sam finally said, voice low and cold. "But I do," Alex pressed, heart pounding. "I found the photo. I've seen." Sam stood abruptly, the movement so sudden it made Alex flinch. "That was a mistake. You shouldn't have looked." Sam's voice had shifted, becoming sharper, darker. There was something in the tone that made Alex's skin crawl, but they couldn't back down now. "What are you hiding?" Alex's voice trembled, but the question had to be asked. Sam turned slowly, the mask facing Alex fully. "The mask isn't for me. It's for you." Alex's breath caught. "What does that mean?" "If you see what's underneath," Sam paused, the voice now almost a whisper, "it'll take you. It feeds on fear. The mask keeps it away." Alex's mind raced, struggling to process Sam's words. A sickening realization began to dawn. The mask wasn't just hiding Sam's face. It was holding something back, something terrible. "Stop asking questions," Sam warned, stepping closer. "Forget about the mask. If you don't, it will make sure you never forget." That night, Alex couldn't sleep. Sam's words replayed over and over in their mind. "It will make sure you never forget." Alex lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what they'd heard. But the fear gnawed at them. What was Sam hiding? And what did they mean by "it feeds on fear"? As the wind howled outside, a storm rolled in, thunder rumbled, shaking the apartment's thin walls, and flashes of lightning lit up the darkened room. Alex tossed and turned, struggling to drown out the growing sense of dread. Then, amidst the storm's roar, came a sharp sound from the hallway, a heavy thud, like something hitting the floor. Heart racing, Alex got up and crept to the hallway. The air felt heavy, charged with more than just the storm. Lightning illuminated the scene. Sam stood at the end of the hallway, mask lying on the floor at their feet. Alex froze. The face that stared back was no longer human. It was twisted, grotesque, just as it had been in the photo, but worse. The skin was warped and melted, the eyes dark hollows that seemed to suck in all light. The air grew thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Suddenly, shadows in the room shifted unnaturally. They crawled across the floor, stretching toward Alex. Whispered voices filled the air, unintelligible but urgent, as if calling to something. The entity that Sam had warned about was no longer contained. It was here, unleashed. Alex's legs gave out, collapsing against the wall. The darkness felt alive, pulsating, pressing against their chest. As they gasped for breath, Sam lunged for the mask, but the entity swirled around them both, distorting reality. Nothing felt real anymore. Only terror remained. Sam struggled against the swirling shadows, reaching desperately for the mask. The air was thick with the weight of the entity, pressing down on everything, warping the space around them. Just as Alex felt themselves slipping into a darkness far deeper than fear, Sam managed to clasp the mask and force it back onto their face. Instantly, the oppressive presence receded. The shadows retreated, the room snapping back to its former, distorted normalcy. Sam slumped to the ground, breathing heavily, their masked face turned away from Alex. Alex, still trembling, pushed themselves up, their mind reeling. They couldn't shake the sensation of those hollow, consuming eyes. "It's contained again," Sam whispered, their voice fragile, as if drained. "But it's never really gone." The apartment felt suffocating. Alex knew they couldn't stay here, not after this. The nightmares wouldn't stop. And the mask, Sam's mask, would always be there, watching, waiting. Alex left the apartment the next morning, suitcase in hand, barely looking back. As they reached the street, they saw a new tenant arriving, oblivious to what lurked inside. Sam stood in the doorway, the mask securely in place, watching. Even outside, Alex felt it, the entity was still watching.